Not many of you in this congregation will have recollections of the Second World War. John will. Anyone else? One or two, right. Let me give you my credentials for speaking on this remembrance service. My father was a returned soldier from the First World War, but returned in a very interesting way. The troop ship left Auckland on the 11th of November 1918 and did a U-turn and came back to Auckland, and then he came back to Australia. But in the eyes of his country, he was a returned soldier because he'd left these shores. Had a cousin who was in the army in the Second World War and was captured and spent several years in Changi prison. If you've been to Lord Howe Island, you will know that there is a plane crashed in one of the paddocks there. My cousin Bill, who served as a navigator in the Second World War, flew many missions over Germany, came back to Australia, remained in the Air Force, and in 1950 he went on a training session with some of his mates to Lord Howe Island. His best friend was ill that day, so Bill went in his place and the plane sprang a leak and crashed, and Bill died. It's interesting that no one has tried to souvenir any of the parts of that plane which still lies in that paddock. It's also interesting that one of the citizens of Lord Howe Island received the George Cross, the highest civilian decoration, for the part that he played in trying to rescue some of the people in that plane. He got 2 out and was on his way back to get a third when the plane exploded. I missed out on national service by a week because I was too old. And I'm probably still too old to do national service. My memories of World War II. I remember the Air Force officials coming to my school, I'm going to say arrested, probably not, but taking into custody one of our senior students who turned 18 and was due to go into the Air Force. I remember rationing. I remember charcoal burners on the back of cars. I remember the night that the Japanese reconnaissance plane flew over our house, and the next day Sydney Harbour was shelled. I remember rationing. I remember the little church that I went to, and they had a prayer list for all the soldiers from our church who were there. And isn't it interesting? Not one of them died. Does that mean that God favoured our church and not your church? Not really. And so here we are today, not glorifying war, but remembering. Someone rather cynically wrote, "War is a place where young people who don't know each other and don't hate each other kill each other by the decision of old people who know each other and hate each other but don't kill each other." I'm always moved by the playing of the last post in Ravelli. By the way, thank you, Joseph. That bugle that you heard comes from the First World War. It was owned by a previous minister's uncle. Chris Page's uncle owned that bugle. But we have the last post and then silence. And in the book of Job, it says, Eliphaz had a spiritual experience and he says, "I heard a voice. In that silence, I heard a voice." So I guess it's the voice of the past, the voice of memory. I have an addiction for TV documentaries about World War II and World War I. And we remember today that there are some people who still bear in their bodies and in their minds the scars of war, particularly the Vietnam War. And you'd remember when we had days of prayer to a God whom since then we've chosen to ignore. It was the voice of the past. But it was also the voice of sacrifice. Oh, how young they were. We went to Villas Bretna, and as we walked up to the Sir John Monash Museum, there were rows and rows of crosses. And one was from an old man who was 24. Most of them were younger. And some of them volunteered for a great adventure, and others had their marble drawn out of a barrel. But on Gallipoli and Normandy and the jungles of Myanmar, Vietnam, the Kokoda Trail, the African desert, at sea, in the air, they died. And I guess not many had a clear idea of the political aims of war, but they were really fighting to preserve certain values. And we today enjoy the fruits of their sacrifice. It is well that today we should be reminded of the sacrifices of others and ask ourselves, how are we using the gifts that they obtained at such great price? It was the voice of the past, the voice of sacrifice. It was the voice of duty. Am I being too idealistic when I say we have a duty to those who suffered and died? Not over 1 minute's silence, not about buying a badge on Anzac Day. Our duty can only be fulfilled when we have dedicated our lives to the service of others. In my first church, when I was a student minister, there was Mr. McLaren. It was 6 months before I knew his story. He was in the First World War. A shell landed in his trench and he lost both his legs. You wouldn't know it. He was always at every service, every meeting of the church. There was Mr. Mac. And how did he respond to that tragedy? Well, if he heard of someone who had lost a limb in an accident, or someone from the war that had lost a limb, he would go and visit them and show them what could be done. And so we look at our duty. The refugees, the homeless, the underprivileged, the Indigenous. And if one should come back from those wars, would they find that we were less selfish, less prejudiced, more tolerant, more loving, less greedy, fewer divisions? I love the story of the soldier who died, and because he wasn't a believer, he could not be buried in consecrated ground. And so he was buried just outside of the consecrated ground. And that night his mates went out and they moved the fence. Silence and a voice. The voice of memory and sacrifice and duty, but also the voice of God. The souls of the righteous are in the hands of God. There shall no torment touch them. They are at peace. Amen.